left the harbor of Bridgetown, Barbados, and sailed north into the Atlantic Ocean toward Baltimore, Maryland. She was carrying 11,000 tons of manganese ore in her holds. She had 309 men on board. Her captain had reported a cracked engine cylinder before leaving Brazil. Her hull was sitting so low in the water that the port officials in Barbados had specifically noted she appeared overloaded. The weather reports for the days ahead showed nothing unusual. The distance remaining to Baltimore was approximately 1,800 nautical miles. The USS Cyclops never arrived. No distress signal was ever received. No wreckage was ever found. No body was ever recovered. The ocean between Barbados and Baltimore was searched extensively by ships and aircraft over the weeks that followed, and then over the months and years and decades, and eventually the century that followed. And nothing that could be conclusively identified as coming from the USS Cyclops was ever pulled from the water. 309 men went into the Atlantic on March 4th, 1918, and the ocean simply closed over them. The disappearance of the USS Cyclops remains the single largest loss of life in the entire history of the United States Navy that did not involve direct combat at sea. It happened in the middle of the First World War, when the United States government was tracking naval movements with exceptional intensity. It happened to a ship so large she was 542 feet long and weighed 19,000 tons when fully loaded. It happened with no warning, no explanation, and no physical trace. More than 100 years later, nobody knows what happened. This is the story of the ship that vanished without a trace. To understand what the USS Cyclops was, and why her disappearance was so profoundly shocking to the people who lived through it, you need to understand the world of naval logistics in the early 20th century. In 1918, the engine of naval power was coal. Every warship in the United States Navy, every battleship and cruiser and destroyer ran on coal-fired steam engines. The great battleships of the era consumed enormous quantities of coal just to move. A fast battleship steaming at full speed could burn hundreds of tons of coal in a single day. This created a fundamental problem of supply that shaped the entire strategy of naval warfare. A warship can only carry a limited amount of coal in her own bunkers. Without regular resupply, even the most powerful battleship in the world is dead in the water. The solution was colliers, specialized ships designed to carry coal in enormous quantities and transfer it to warships at sea or in port. Colliers were the lifeblood of naval power. Without them, no fleet could operate across the distances that modern warfare required. The USS Cyclops was one of the most capable colliers the United States Navy had ever built. She was constructed by the William Cramp and Sons Ship and Engine Building Company in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Her keel was laid down in 1909. She was launched on May 7, 1910. At 542 feet long and 65 feet wide, she was enormous by the standards of her time. Her cargo capacity was 8,000 long tons, though she would be loaded to well beyond that on her final voyage. She was equipped with 2 triple-expansion steam engines that could drive her at a top speed of 14.5 knots. She had a crew of around 200 men in peacetime operations, though by 1918, that number had grown as the Navy added personnel for wartime duties. She was named after the Cyclops of Greek mythology, the one-eyed giants who were sons of Poseidon, god of the sea. The name seemed appropriate for a ship of such power and size. it would turn out to be appropriate in a way no one intended. Because like the mythological Cyclops, the ship would eventually be defeated not by any external enemy, but by a combination of blindness and arrogance that came from within. From her commissioning in 1910 through the early years of the First World War, the USS Cyclops operated throughout the Atlantic, Caribbean, and European waters. She supplied coal to American naval vessels operating in the Baltic in 1911. She supported the occupation of Veracruz, Mexico in 1914. She made voyage after voyage across the Atlantic, delivering the coal that kept the Navy's engines turning. When the United States formally entered the First World War in April of 1917, the Cyclops was commissioned into direct wartime service. Lieutenant Commander George W. Worley was placed in command. On June 1, 1917, she joined a convoy bound for Saint-Nazaire, France, helping to supply American naval forces that were beginning to arrive in European waters in substantial numbers. She returned to the American East Coast in July of 1917 and spent the next several months operating along the eastern seaboard and making a brief voyage to Halifax, Nova Scotia. By January of 1918, she had been assigned to the Naval Overseas Transportation Service, with orders to travel to Brazil. The mission seemed straightforward. She would carry coal from Norfolk, Virginia, to Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, where the coal would supply British naval vessels operating in the South Atlantic. Then she would load a cargo of manganese ore in Brazil and bring it back to the United States, where the ore was desperately needed for the production of steel for weapons and military equipment. She left Norfolk on January 9, 1918. It was the beginning of her last voyage. The journey to Rio de Janeiro went without major incident. The Cyclops arrived in Rio on January 28, 1918, and spent 2 weeks unloading her coal and preparing for the return voyage. During those 2 weeks, something happened in the cargo holds of the Cyclops that would become central to every theory about what eventually destroyed her. The crew began loading manganese ore. Manganese ore is not like coal. Coal is relatively light and compressible, and a ship designed to carry 8,000 tons of coal has structural supports, deck arrangements, and loading procedures calibrated for that specific type of cargo. Manganese ore is dramatically denser than coal. The same physical volume of manganese ore weighs substantially more than the same volume of coal. A ship loaded to her visible waterline with manganese ore is carrying significantly more weight than a ship loaded to the same visible waterline with coal. The stevedores and crew loaded 11,000 tons of manganese ore into the Cyclops's holds. Her maximum rated capacity was 8,000 long tons. Port officials and naval records later confirmed that the ship was sitting measurably below her plimsoll line when she left Brazil. The plimsoll line is the marking on the hull of every ship that indicates the maximum safe load the vessel can carry. When the waterline of a loaded ship sits above the plimsoll mark, the ship is legally and practically overloaded. The risk of sinking increases substantially. The ability to handle rough weather decreases substantially. The structural stresses on the hull increase substantially. The Cyclops left Rio de Janeiro on February 16, 1918, carrying 3,000 tons more cargo than she was rated to safely carry, in a ship designed for a different type of cargo, on an engine that was already partially broken. Because before she left Rio, Commander Worley had submitted a formal report to naval authorities documenting a serious mechanical problem. The starboard engine, one of the two engines that drove the ship, had developed a cracked cylinder. The cracked cylinder made the starboard engine inoperative. The Cyclops was proceeding on a single engine. A survey board reviewed Commander Worley's report and confirmed the engine problem was real. They did not order the ship to remain in Brazil for repairs. Instead, they recommended that the ship proceed to the United States, where the repairs could be made on arrival. The logic seemed defensible in wartime. The manganese ore was urgently needed. Delays cost money, and more importantly cost time, and in 1918, time was measured in lives. Better to limp home at reduced speed and get the repairs done there than to delay the cargo further. So Commander Worley accepted the recommendation, loaded his overweight cargo into his partially broken ship, and set out across the Atlantic with 309 men in his care. The Cyclops reached Salvador, Brazil on February 20. She departed Salvador on February 22, headed north. 2 weeks later, she made an unscheduled stop in Barbados. The stop in Barbados on March 3 and 4, 1918, is one of the most discussed details in the entire story of the Cyclops, because what happened there raises questions that have never been fully answered. Commander Worley's orders had not included a stop in Barbados. The ship was supposed to sail directly from Brazil to Baltimore. An unscheduled stop in a foreign port while operating under wartime orders required explanation and justification. Commander Worley's explanation was that the ship needed additional supplies and that the water level over the Plimsoll line necessitated the stop. The United States consul in Barbados at the time was a man named Brockholst Livingston. In his official report, filed after the Cyclops disappeared, Livingston described what he observed during the ship's stay in Bridgetown Harbor. He noted that the ship was indeed sitting low in the water, confirming that she appeared overloaded. He noted that Commander Worley seemed to him unusual in his behavior. His report described Worley in terms that suggest a man under extraordinary stress, or possibly a man behaving in ways that Livingston found professionally irregular. He noted that the crew of the Cyclops included a large number of men with Germanic surnames, and he filed his report, and the Cyclops left Barbados on the afternoon of March 4, 1918, and sailed north toward Baltimore, Maryland. No one from that ship was ever seen again. The search for the Cyclops began in earnest by mid-March 1918, when the ship failed to arrive in Baltimore by her expected date. The Navy initially assumed the delay was weather or engine trouble. The single operating engine would have reduced her speed from the normal 14 knots to approximately 10 knots, adding days to the journey. They waited. But the days passed, and the Cyclops did not arrive. No message came from her. No signal was received. Nothing appeared in the Atlantic shipping lanes that could be identified as wreckage from a ship her size. The Navy sent ships to search the route between Barbados and Baltimore. They found nothing. A tanker called the Amulco later reported a possible sighting of the Cyclops near Virginia on March 9, suggesting she had nearly completed her journey before something happened. But when naval investigators questioned the captain of the Amulco, he denied having made any such report. The claimed sighting was never verified. On March 10, 1918, a violent storm swept through the Virginia Capes region, the waters just off the coast of Virginia, where the Atlantic meets the approaches to the Chesapeake Bay. If the Cyclops had been somewhere in that area on that date, and if the reported Amulco sighting had any truth to it, she would have been in the path of that storm. Overloaded, running on one engine, in a violent Atlantic storm, with no ability to make significant speed. But this is speculation. The sighting was denied. The storm explanation requires accepting a contested report. What is not speculation is this. The United States Navy launched one of the largest search efforts in its history at that time, extending over months, covering thousands of square miles of ocean, and they found nothing. Not a piece of hull plating, not a life ring, not a hatch cover, or a barrel, or a boot, or a personal belonging, not a single body, not one fragment that could be identified as coming from a 542-foot steel ship carrying 11,000 tons of dense ore. This absence of physical evidence became the most disturbing aspect of the entire disappearance. Ships sink all the time. Storms sink ships. Mechanical failures sink ships. German submarines in 1918 were sinking ships in the Atlantic with terrifying regularity. But when ships sink, they typically leave something behind. Debris fields, floating wreckage, oil slicks, bodies. The Cyclops left nothing. When ships sink catastrophically, when they break apart suddenly and go down so fast that nothing floats away, it usually means the sinking happened with extraordinary violence and speed. A gradual sinking leaves floating debris everywhere. An instant catastrophic sinking, where the entire ship goes down in minutes or even seconds, can leave almost nothing on the surface. The Cyclops sank so completely that the ocean surface showed no sign she had ever existed. 3 weeks after she left Barbados, the United States Navy officially listed the USS Cyclops as lost with all hands. 309 men, the largest single non-combat loss of life in the history of the United States Navy. President Woodrow Wilson was briefed on the disappearance. His assessment was reported in several newspaper accounts of the time. He said simply that the disappearance of the Cyclops was one of the most baffling mysteries in the annals of the Navy. 107 years later, it remains exactly that. When a disaster happens and leaves no physical evidence, and when the investigation cannot determine a cause, the human mind does not accept silence. It generates theories. Some of those theories are rational and grounded in available evidence. Others reach for explanations that go beyond anything the evidence supports. In the case of the USS Cyclops, every kind of theory appeared over the century following her disappearance. The first and most immediately prominent theory in 1918 was German action. The United States was at war with Germany. German submarines were operating throughout the Atlantic, sinking Allied shipping at a rate that genuinely threatened to determine the outcome of the war. In the spring of 1918, German U-boats were responsible for the loss of hundreds of thousands of tons of shipping every month. The idea that a German submarine had encountered the Cyclops and sunk her was entirely plausible as a general proposition, and there were specific circumstances that made the theory more pointed. Commander Worley was not who he claimed to be. The investigation that followed the Cyclops' disappearance revealed that Lieutenant Commander George W. Worley of the United States Navy was actually a German national named Johann Friedrich Wickmann. He had been born in 1862 in Sandstadt, in the Hanover province of Germany. He had come to the United States in 1878 by jumping ship in San Francisco Harbor, illegally entering the country and abandoning his German merchant vessel. He had spent years in San Francisco, operating a saloon on the notoriously lawless Barbary Coast, involved, according to some accounts, in the transport of illegal goods, including opium from the Far East. He had at some point assumed the name Worley, taking it from a friend. By 1898, he had somehow established himself as a licensed ship's master and had begun commanding civilian merchant vessels. Eventually, he had come to the attention of the Naval Auxiliary Service and had been employed commanding colliers. His crew knew something was unusual about him, even if they did not know the full details. They had a nickname for him. They called him the Damned Dutchman. The Office of Naval Intelligence launched an investigation into Worley's background and loyalties after the Cyclops disappeared. They confirmed everything described above. He was German-born. He had entered the country illegally. He had a documented history of erratic and brutal behavior toward the men under his command. Multiple accounts from former crew members described him as tyrannical, given to drinking, and seemingly indifferent to proper seamanship. One particularly revealing account came from an officer named Conrad Nervig, who had served aboard the Cyclops for a period but had disembarked before the final voyage. Nervig later wrote and testified extensively about conditions aboard the ship. He described Worley as a gruff eccentric who carried a cane like an affectation of authority while displaying few actual qualities of a competent commander. He described an incident in which one of the ship engines was activated while a crewman was nearby in a small boat. The force of the propeller pulled the boat in, and the sailor was knocked overboard and drowned. Nervig blamed the incident on the chaotic and demoralized state of the crew that resulted from Worley's methods of command. There had also reportedly been a mutiny aboard the Cyclops at some point before her final voyage. The mutiny was said to have been suppressed quickly, and the men involved punished. But the fact that it had occurred at all spoke to the level of discontent among the crew. One of the passengers on the final voyage added another layer to the suspicion. Alfred Louis Moreau Gottschalk was the United States Consul General in Rio de Janeiro and was traveling back to the United States aboard the Cyclops. He was known to hold pro-German sympathies, an unusual characteristic for an American diplomat at the height of America's war against Germany. Taken together, these details created a compelling narrative. A German-born captain with a false identity, commanding a demoralized crew that had attempted mutiny, carrying a pro-German diplomat as a passenger, making an unexplained, unscheduled stop in a neutral port, then vanishing without sending a distress signal. The possibility that Worley had handed the ship to the German Navy or had guided her to a position where a German submarine was waiting seemed to many people in 1918 to be the most plausible explanation. The Office of Naval Intelligence investigated this theory exhaustively. After the war ended in November 1918, German naval records were reviewed in detail. Every U-boat patrol and every ship sinking that German submarines had claimed was documented. The records were searched specifically for any mention of the Cyclops. There was nothing. No German submarine had reported sinking a collier of the Cyclops' size anywhere near the route between Barbados and Baltimore in March 1918. No German naval record mentioned the Cyclops at all. The theory of German action, whether by submarine attack or by Worley's betrayal, was definitively refuted by the German records themselves. Worley had not surrendered the ship to Germany. Germany had not sunk the ship. Whatever happened to the Cyclops, the Germans had nothing to do with it. This left the investigation with nothing. No German action, no wreckage, no survivors, no distress signal, no explanation. The second major theory, and the one that naval historians have generally considered most plausible on technical grounds, is structural failure. To understand this theory, you need to understand what was happening physically inside the USS Cyclops during her final voyage. The ship had been designed to carry coal. Coal is relatively low density. When you fill a cargo hold with coal, The weight distributes fairly evenly across the floor of the hold, because coal settles into a relatively stable pile. The structural design of the Cyclops' holds, her internal framing, her keel supports, and her longitudinal girders had all been calculated with coal cargo in mind. Manganese ore is not like coal. Manganese ore is one of the denser metal ores that ships commonly transported. Where the same volume of coal might weigh perhaps 40 to 50 pounds per cubic foot, manganese ore can weigh more than double that. When you load manganese ore into a hold designed for coal, you are placing far greater stress on the structural elements of the ship for the same apparent load line. The Cyclops was carrying 11,000 tons of manganese ore. Her rated capacity for coal was 8,000 long tons. This means she was already overloaded by a substantial margin for her designed cargo. For manganese ore, the structural implications were dramatically worse. Naval engineers who reviewed the case after the fact noted another specific problem. The Cyclops class of collier had a design feature in their internal structural framework that involved a central I-beam running longitudinally through the ship. This beam was a critical structural element. It bore a significant portion of the stress when the ship was operating in rough seas, particularly the kind of rolling and twisting stresses that occur when a heavily loaded ship encounters beam seas or crossing waves. The manganese ore, because it is denser, concentrates its weight lower in the holds. This changes the ship's center of gravity and alters how she responds to wave action. It also changes the distribution of stress on the structural frame in ways that the original designers had not accounted for. Two of the Cyclops' sister ships, vessels of the same Proteus class built to the same design, later disappeared under similar circumstances in 1941. The USS Proteus and the USS Nereus both vanished while carrying heavy metallic ore cargoes. Naval engineers and metallurgists who investigated those later disappearances found evidence that the central I-beam of the Proteus-class colliers was susceptible to corrosion and structural fatigue, particularly when the ships were operated in tropical waters and carried the kinds of dense metallic cargoes that accelerated corrosion of certain steel components. The working theory that emerged from those later investigations, applied retrospectively to the Cyclops, was that the structural failure may have been sudden and catastrophic. Under certain conditions of cargo loading and sea state, the central I-beam could fail. Once that central structural element failed, the ship would not simply begin taking on water gradually. She would buckle. The two halves of the hull, no longer held together by the spine of the ship, would each go down separately and rapidly, taking everything aboard with them before anything could float away. This would explain the complete absence of debris, a catastrophic structural failure that causes the ship to fold and sink in minutes or even seconds would leave no floating wreckage because nothing would have time to separate from the sinking hull. Every piece of wood, every barrel, every piece of equipment that might otherwise float would be dragged down by the suction of a 542-foot ship going to the bottom quickly. The cracked cylinder in the starboard engine matters here as well. With only one engine operating, the Cyclops could not make her normal speed. She could not maneuver effectively to keep her bow into dangerous seas. If she encountered a severe storm, she could not run before it or adjust her heading to reduce the stress of wave action. She was slow. She was heavy. She was structurally compromised by an overweight and wrong-type cargo, and she had no ability to apply power on the starboard side to compensate for any dangerous tendency to roll or list. The violent storm reported in the Virginia Capes area on March 10, 1918, fits this picture with uncomfortable precision. If the Cyclops had been somewhere in that region on or around that date, the combination of the storm, the overloaded holds, the single engine, and a possible structural weakness in the I-beam could have produced a catastrophic failure in a matter of minutes. Naval historians who have studied the case most extensively generally conclude that some version of this catastrophic structural failure scenario is the most likely explanation for what happened. The absence of wreckage, which seems so mysterious at first, is actually more consistent with catastrophic sudden sinking than with a gradual sinking. The presence of the overload, the wrong cargo type, the broken engine, and the confirmed storm in the probable vicinity all point in the same direction. But this is still only a theory. No wreck has been confirmed. No physical evidence has been examined. The structural failure explanation is plausible. It is consistent with the available evidence. It explains the absence of debris better than any other rational theory. It does not explain everything. The third major theory about the Cyclops has to do with the region of ocean she was sailing through when she disappeared, a region that would not receive its famous name until decades later, but was already, in 1918, developing a reputation among sailors for the strange things that happened there. The Bermuda Triangle. The term itself was coined in 1964 by a writer named Vincent Gaddis in an article for Argosy magazine. But the idea it described, the notion that the waters roughly bounded by the island of Bermuda to the northeast, Miami and the Florida coast to the west, and Puerto Rico to the south, formed an area where ships and later aircraft disappeared with unusual frequency, had been building in maritime folklore for decades before the term was invented. The USS Cyclops was sailing through the northeastern portion of this region when she disappeared. Her route from Barbados to Baltimore passed through the western Atlantic waters that would later be incorporated into the Bermuda Triangle. For the Bermuda Triangle theory to mean anything, you have to believe that the region actually has an unusual disappearance rate compared to other ocean areas of similar traffic density. You have to believe that something about those specific waters causes ships to vanish in ways that other ocean areas do not. The scientific and statistical evidence for this is, to put it plainly, very weak. Lloyd's of London, the world's oldest insurance market, and the organization with the most detailed records of maritime incidents in history, has stated explicitly that the Bermuda Triangle does not have an unusually high rate of maritime incidents compared to other heavily traveled ocean regions. The United States Coast Guard has issued similar assessments. Multiple detailed statistical studies of recorded maritime incidents have failed to find any meaningful clustering of disappearances in the Bermuda Triangle region that exceeds what would be expected based on traffic volume alone. The reason the Bermuda Triangle appears in the popular mind to be more dangerous than other ocean regions is largely a product of selective reporting. Incidents that occur in the Bermuda Triangle are labeled as Bermuda Triangle incidents and compiled into books and articles and television programs about the mystery. Incidents of equal or greater mystery that occur in other ocean regions are reported as individual events and forgotten. The pattern is an artifact of how information is collected and presented, not a reflection of an actual pattern in the ocean itself. The Bermuda Triangle explanation for the Cyclops is, in other words, not really an explanation at all. It is a label that groups the Cyclops' disappearance with other disappearances in the same general region, and then invites the listener to assume that the clustering itself is evidence of something unusual, when in fact the clustering is produced by the label, none of which means the Bermuda Triangle theories are not fascinating. They are fascinating. They are fascinating for the same reason that ghost stories are fascinating, which is that they locate the source of danger in something vast and mysterious and beyond rational control. A ship sinking because of a structural failure caused by overloading and bad seamanship is a tragedy. a ship sinking because of the inexplicable power of a malevolent ocean region, is something that touches a different and older part of human psychology. The ocean has been killing sailors for as long as there have been sailors. The Bermuda Triangle is one of the ways that modern people have given a name and a shape to the ancient knowledge that the sea does not care whether you live or die, and that sometimes people go out on the water and simply do not come back, and there is no explanation that will ever be fully satisfying. But for the USS Cyclops specifically, the Bermuda Triangle is probably not the answer. The structural failure and overloading theory is far better supported by the actual technical and historical evidence. There is one more piece of the story that deserves careful attention, because it illuminates something important about the Cyclops that goes beyond the immediate question of what sank her. Commander George Worley, born Johann Friedrich Wichmann, was by all accounts a deeply problematic commander. The accounts that exist of his behavior as a ship's captain, drawn from the testimony of men who served under him, and from the investigation conducted by the Office of Naval Intelligence, paint a consistent picture. He was described repeatedly as brutal toward his crew. He berated officers and enlisted men in front of their colleagues. He used his position to humiliate people. He made arbitrary decisions without apparent reason and then enforced them with threats. His methods of command were so counterproductive that they produced a crew that Conrad Nervig described as thoroughly demoralized and disorganized. Demoralized crews make mistakes. Disorganized ships are maintained poorly. Equipment that should be inspected is not inspected. Problems that should be reported are not reported. The culture of a ship reflects the culture of her captain, and a captain who rules through fear rather than competence creates a vessel where the critical information needed to make good decisions does not flow upward. Consider what this means for the final voyage of the Cyclops. The ship was overloaded. Did the crew understand how dangerous the overload was? Did anyone with technical knowledge of what the excess weight of manganese ore meant for the ship's structural tolerances have the ability or the willingness to bring that information to the captain's attention? The engine was broken. Commander Worley himself reported this, which suggests he was at least willing to report major mechanical problems. But what about the smaller problems? What about the things that were not quite bad enough to report officially, but were warning signs of deeper trouble? In a well-functioning naval vessel, a strong reporting culture ensures that the captain has access to accurate information about the condition of his ship. In a ship commanded by a tyrant who responds to bad news with intimidation, the information the captain receives may not accurately reflect reality. The mutiny that reportedly occurred aboard the Cyclops before her final voyage is significant for this reason. A crew that has tried to mutiny and failed is a crew living under the additional weight of punishment and resentment. The men involved in the mutiny would have been under disciplinary action. The crew as a whole would have been aware that challenging the captain's authority had direct consequences. In such an environment, the natural human tendency to report problems, to say that something does not seem right, to raise a concern, would be significantly suppressed. And there is one detail from the Barbados stop that has always seemed particularly significant to investigators who have studied the case carefully. When the Cyclops stopped in Barbados on March 3, it was specifically noted by port officials that the ship was sitting below her plimsoll line. The plimsoll line is not a suggestion. It is a legally defined safety standard. A ship sitting below her plimsoll line is legally and practically overloaded. Barbados port officials documented this. Commander Worley was aware of the overload. He had stopped in Barbados partly because of it. He was taking on additional supplies there, and then he left anyway. He sailed out of Barbados Harbor on the afternoon of March 4 in an overloaded ship running on a single engine, heading into Atlantic waters in the middle of March. March in the North Atlantic is one of the most dangerous times of year for exactly the conditions that would be most dangerous to an overloaded single-engine ship. Late winter and early spring bring frequent and violent storms to the western Atlantic. The nor'easter that later struck the Virginia Capes region was not an unusual or unpredictable event. It was exactly the kind of weather that March reliably produces in that part of the ocean. Worley knew all of this. His career at sea, whatever else might be said about him, was long and extensive. He had been sailing these waters for decades. He knew what March storms in the western Atlantic were like. He knew his ship was overloaded. He knew one of his engines was broken. And he left anyway. Whether this decision reflected German loyalty, as early investigators suspected, or reckless indifference to risk, as the technical evidence suggests, or simply the calculation that the wartime urgency of the mission overrode any individual captain's concerns, we cannot know. We cannot know because Worley died with his ship and left no record of his reasoning. What we know is that he took a broken, overloaded ship into dangerous water in dangerous weather, and 309 men went down with him. The families of the men who died on the USS Cyclops lived with uncertainty in a way that is particularly difficult to process. When a soldier dies in battle, there is a body, or at least a grave, or at least a confirmed report that death occurred at a specific place and time. The grief is terrible, but it has an object. It has a location. It has a date. When 309 men sail out of Barbados Harbor and simply disappear, the grief has no object. There is no grave. There is no confirmed place of death. There is no confirmed date of death. There is no last letter, because the ship was at sea when she was lost. There is no description of the last moments, because no one survived to describe them. The families of the Cyclops crew spent months after March 1918 in a state that was not quite grief, but was not quite hope either. They waited for news that did not come. They waited for the investigation to produce an answer that it could not produce. They waited for the telegram that would confirm the worst, and instead, they received only silence. Some families held on to hope for years. The absence of bodies, the absence of confirmed wreckage, the absence of any definitive explanation left a crack in the certainty of loss through which hope could force itself. Perhaps the ship had been captured by Germany and the crew were prisoners of war. Perhaps they had been stranded on a remote island. Perhaps something had happened that would eventually be explained and the men would come home. They did not come home. The Navy officially declared the Cyclops and all hands lost in 1918. The declaration was legal and administrative. It did not provide closure. How could it? The ship was simply gone. Several families attempted legal challenges to the declaration, seeking to have their relatives declared alive rather than dead, hoping against evidence that some explanation would emerge that did not end in death. The courts and the Navy upheld the official determination. The men were dead. The ship was lost. The cause was unknown. Unknown. That word is the cruelest part of the entire story. Not killed in action, which at least provides a narrative. Not lost in a storm, which at least provides a cause. Unknown. 309 men, and the best answer that the United States Navy and all the investigative resources of a wartime government could produce was unknown. The Navy's investigation into the disappearance of the USS Cyclops produced a comprehensive report that examined every theory and every piece of available evidence. The report was completed in 1918, and its conclusions were measured and careful. The investigation found no evidence of German action. German records after the war confirmed this finding. The investigation found significant evidence of operational problems that could have contributed to a catastrophic accident. The overloading, the broken engine, the captain's history of poor seamanship and abusive command, the reported mutiny, the inexperienced crew loading cargo they had never worked with before. The investigation concluded that the most likely explanation was that some combination of these operational problems, probably including the overload and the engine failure, had led to a catastrophic structural failure in severe weather, producing a sinking so sudden and complete that no distress signal could be sent and no debris was left on the surface. But the investigation was also honest about its limitations. Without physical evidence, without the ship, without a single survivor, a definitive conclusion was impossible. The official finding was that the loss was probably due to the overloaded condition of the vessel, operating in heavy weather with a damaged engine, but that the exact cause could not be determined. This is where the investigation ended in 1918. This is where it has remained ever since. Subsequent investigations have added details. The discovery that the Cyclops' sister ships, Proteus and Nereus, both disappeared under similar cargo conditions in 1941, added significant weight to the structural failure theory. If 3 ships of identical design all disappeared while carrying heavy metallic ore, the pattern suggests a design vulnerability rather than individual bad luck. The engineering analysis of the central I-beam and its susceptibility to corrosion and fatigue under certain cargo loads is consistent across all 3 disappearances. But the Cyclops herself has never been found. The ocean between Barbados and the Virginia Capes has been searched with technologies that were completely unavailable in 1918. Side-scan sonar can map the ocean floor in extraordinary detail. Remotely operated vehicles can investigate promising contacts at depths that divers cannot reach. Satellite and computer modeling can calculate likely drift and sinking patterns based on known currents and weather data. None of it has produced a confirmed identification of the USS Cyclops. The ocean in that region is not uniformly shallow. Parts of it are very deep indeed. A ship that sank quickly and went straight to the bottom in deep water, in an area where the search was not focused precisely, could remain undiscovered indefinitely, even with modern technology. But we have not found her. She remains technically missing. There is one aspect of the Cyclops story that rarely gets the attention it deserves because it is less dramatic than the mystery of the disappearance itself, but more important for understanding the full human weight of what happened. The 309 men aboard the USS Cyclops were not abstractions. They were individual human beings with names and faces and families and histories. They ranged in rank from Commander Worley himself down to the most junior enlisted men. Some were Navy regulars, career sailors who had been at sea for years. Some were recent volunteers who had enlisted after the United States entered the war in 1917. Some were officers. Some were civilians serving in auxiliary capacities. Alfred Gottschalk, the pro-German consul general from Rio, was one of them. They came from all over the United States. They came from coastal towns where going to sea was a family tradition. They came from inland cities where the Navy represented adventure and a steady paycheck. They came from immigrant communities where military service was a path to citizenship and belonging. Some of them were young. The Navy in 1918 included men who had enlisted at 17 or 18. Some of them had been at sea for only a few months before joining the crew of the Cyclops. The sea was not something they had grown up with. They had chosen it, or been chosen for it by circumstance, and they had ended up on a specific ship at a specific time, and that specific combination had killed them. Some of them had been on the Cyclops for years. They knew her sounds and her movements. They knew which hatches stuck and which lines ran easy. They knew where the good spots were to sleep, away from the engine noise, and where the drafts were worst in cold weather. The ship was their home, in the way that ships become home for the men who spend their working lives aboard them. All 309 of them were at sea on March 4th, 1918, when the Cyclops left Barbados for the last time. What they experienced in their final hours, if the structural failure theory is correct, was probably not the slow horror of a ship taking on water gradually while the crew had time to process what was happening. Catastrophic structural failure is, by its nature, sudden. One moment the ship is sailing, damaged and overloaded and battered by whatever weather she was in, but sailing. Then the central structural support fails. The hull buckles. The sea comes in everywhere at once. In 90 seconds, according to engineering simulations that have modeled this type of failure, the ship would be going down. In 90 seconds, 309 men go from being alive and on a ship to being in the water, in March, in the North Atlantic, in whatever storm was producing the conditions that finally broke the Cyclops' overstressed hull. The water temperature in that region in March is cold enough to be quickly lethal to someone who enters it without survival equipment. Hypothermia would have set in within minutes. The cold, the shock, the darkness, the enormous suction of a huge ship going down. It would have been over very quickly. We want the deaths of people to be meaningful. We want them to have purpose, or at least dignity. We want there to be something to say beyond the bare fact that they went to sea and did not come back. For the crew of the Cyclops, the most honest thing that can be said is this: they were sailors doing their jobs during wartime. They were subject to decisions they did not make, carrying cargo they had never worked with before, in a ship that was not in proper condition, under a captain who had not earned their trust. They had attempted, at least some of them, to challenge the conditions they were serving under, and they had been punished for it. They did not know, on March 4, 1918, when the Cyclops left Barbados Harbor, that they were sailing to their deaths. None of them woke up that morning with any reason to think that this day would be different from all the other days. The sea was there. The ship was there. The orders were there. They did their jobs, and the ocean took them. The question that always follows a story like this is whether it could happen again. Whether the conditions that produced the disappearance of the USS Cyclops, an overloaded ship with mechanical problems, commanded by a man whose judgment could not be trusted, could produce the same result today. The honest answer is that the specific combination of factors that destroyed the Cyclops is much less likely today than it was in 1918, for reasons that are directly traceable to what was learned from her disappearance and from the subsequent disappearances of her sister ships. Modern ships carry sophisticated real-time structural monitoring equipment. Sensors embedded in the hull track stress on critical structural elements and alert the crew when stresses approach dangerous levels. A modern collier experiencing the kind of structural stress that likely preceded the Cyclops' final moments would have alarms going off in the ship's control center. The crew would know. Modern load management technology and regulations are far more precise about cargo weight and distribution. The kind of casual overloading that saw the Cyclops sailing 3,000 tons over her rated capacity with the wrong type of cargo would not be permitted under modern classification society rules, which have significant teeth in the form of insurance requirements and port state control inspections. Ships that do not meet load line requirements face consequences that include being detained in port until the violation is corrected. Modern engines are more reliable, and modern maintenance standards are more rigorous. A cracked cylinder in a main engine today would result in a mandatory repair before departure, not a recommendation to proceed at reduced speed and fix it when you get there. Modern communication technology means that a ship in distress almost anywhere in the world can send a distress signal that will be received within seconds. Satellite communication systems, emergency position indicating radio beacons that automatically activate when a ship sinks, GPS tracking that allows authorities to know where a ship is at any given moment. All of these technologies mean that the complete disappearance of a large vessel without any communication is effectively impossible in normal circumstances today. And the standards that govern naval command, the expectations for how officers treat the men under their command, have changed substantially since the era when a man like George Worley could abuse his crew with impunity and face no meaningful accountability. But the sea has not changed. The Atlantic in March is still exactly as dangerous as it was in 1918. The physical forces that tear at a heavily loaded ship in severe weather are exactly the same forces they have always been. Dense metallic ore cargo is still a challenging and unforgiving material to carry at sea. The basic vulnerability that killed the Cyclops, an improperly loaded ship with mechanical problems in bad weather, is still a vulnerability that exists as long as human beings make bad decisions under pressure. What has changed is our ability to see those vulnerabilities before they become catastrophes, and our willingness to act on what we see. In 1918, port officials in Barbados saw that the Cyclops was overloaded. They noted it in their reports. They did not have the authority, or perhaps the will, to prevent her from leaving. Commander Worley knew his engine was broken. He reported it and was told to proceed anyway. The naval system that sent him out in that condition prioritized the wartime need for manganese ore over the safety of the ship and crew. 309 men paid the price for those decisions. The USS Cyclops has been the subject of more theories, more articles, more books, and more television documentaries than almost any other ship in American naval history. She has been connected to the Bermuda Triangle mythology so thoroughly that many people who know nothing else about her know that she vanished in the triangle. She has been featured in lists of the greatest maritime mysteries of all time so regularly that her name has become synonymous with unexplained disappearance. But the mystery, for all its fascination, has a human core that the mystery-making can sometimes obscure. 309 people died. They died in service to their country during a war. They died because of decisions that were made by other people who were not on the ship when it sank. They died because a system valued cargo over safety. They died because a captain's authority was absolute, even when that captain was inadequate to the responsibilities of command. The mystery of how they died is genuinely unsolved. We do not know with certainty what happened in those final hours or minutes. We do not know whether it was the storm and the structural failure that most historians consider most likely, or something else entirely that no one has yet proposed. We do not know where the wreck is, or whether the wreck can ever be found in the state that would allow definitive conclusions. What we know is that they are gone. The names of the 309 men who died on the USS Cyclops are recorded in the historical archives of the United States Navy. They are listed in the records of the Naval Historical Foundation. They are commemorated on memorials to naval personnel lost in the First World War. Their names are there. Their deaths are recorded. But the how of their dying, the specific sequence of events on specific hours and specific days in March of 1918, remains in the dark water with their ship. The Navy has never stopped, entirely, thinking about the Cyclops. Every few years, new sonar technology becomes available. New search efforts are proposed. New areas of the Atlantic floor are examined with instruments that did not exist the last time anyone looked seriously. Various researchers and adventurers have claimed to have found the wreck or to be close to finding it. None of these claims has been confirmed. The ocean floor between Barbados and the Virginia Capes is large. It is not uniformly mapped. The depth in various sections ranges from relatively shallow coastal shelf waters to deep Atlantic waters where the floor descends to thousands of feet. A 542-foot steel ship is, in absolute terms, a large object. But in the context of the area of ocean she might have sunk in, and at the depths where she might rest, she is a needle in an enormous haystack. The structural failure scenario that most historians favor would place the sinking somewhere in the western Atlantic, probably in the general region around the Bermuda Triangle in the geographic sense, probably in water deep enough that the wreck has not been accidentally discovered in over a century of maritime activity in those waters. If she is where the structural failure theory places her, in deep water, broken apart, her steel hull now corroded by more than a century of saltwater immersion, she may never be identified with certainty, even if a promising contact is found. The evidence that would allow positive identification, her nameplate, her identifying numbers, specific structural features unique to her design, may be degraded beyond recognition. She may simply never be found in a state that permits conclusive identification. And, if she is never found, the mystery remains open in the technical sense forever. Without physical evidence, the structural failure theory remains a theory. Every other theory remains technically possible. The door to the unknown remains permanently ajar. This is not a comfortable conclusion. Humans want closure. We want the mystery to have an ending. We want the investigation to produce the answer, and for the answer to be confirmed, and for the file to be closed. The file on the USS Cyclops is not closed. The ship that vanished without a trace has remained, 107 years later, a ship that vanished without a trace. What does it mean that the most powerful navy in the world cannot find one of its own ships? The United States Navy in the 20th century developed capabilities that would have been literally inconceivable to the sailors of 1918. It operated submarines that could circle the globe without surfacing. It launched aircraft from carriers that sailed in waters that wooden sailing ships could barely have navigated. It developed weapon systems that could hit targets with precision at ranges that would have seemed like science fiction in the First World War. And yet it cannot tell you with certainty where the USS Cyclops is. The ocean is large in a way that modern technology has not fully overcome. The deepest parts of the ocean floor are less thoroughly mapped than the surface of Mars. We know more, in some measurable sense, about distant planets than we know about the bottom of our own ocean. The pressures at depth, the corrosion, the currents, the sediment that accumulates over decades and centuries, all of it works against the preservation and discovery of anything that sinks below a certain depth. The Cyclops went down somewhere in water that may be thousands of feet deep. Even if every modern sonar system in the American Navy's inventory was devoted to searching the most probable sinking location, the search would take years and might still not find her. The sea that took 309 lives in March 1918 has kept its secret for longer than most nations have been independent. It has kept it through 2 world wars and a technological revolution, and the rise and fall of the age of coal-fired naval power that the Cyclops herself represented. It has kept it through the invention of technologies specifically designed to find things lost at sea. Technologies that have found ships sunk in very similar circumstances in very similar waters. And still, it keeps the secret. There is something almost deliberately complete about the way the Cyclops disappeared. Not just the ship gone, but every physical trace gone. Not just the crew dead, but no body ever recovered. Not just the cause unknown, but so thoroughly unknown that even the most modern analysis can only say probably, and most likely, and consistent with. The sea does not give reasons. The families of the crew of the USS Cyclops learned this in 1918 and have been living with it ever since. The Navy learned it through one of the most painful lessons in its history. And anyone who spends time thinking seriously about the disappearance of the Cyclops eventually comes up against the same wall that all the investigators and theorists and historians have come up against. We know what probably happened. We know what was likely wrong with the ship and where she likely was, and what weather was likely battering her in her final hours. We know the decisions that were made and why they were wrong and what the consequences were. But we do not know. The Cyclops is still out there, somewhere in the dark water between Barbados and the Virginia coast, in a depth and location that more than a century of searching has not pinpointed. A 542-foot steel ship is resting on the ocean floor. Around her, scattered by a century of current and whatever violence attended the sinking, are the remains of everything she was carrying and everything her 309 crew members owned and were. The manganese ore that was so urgently needed for the steel mills of wartime America never arrived. It went to the bottom with the ship, and it is still there. The men who loaded it never came home. Their names are on the records, and their deaths are in the archives, but their bodies are in the ocean. Commander Worley, Johann Friedrich Wichmann, the German-born sailor who deceived the United States Navy and possibly deceived himself about what he was doing on the morning of March 4th, 1918, never arrived to answer for his decisions. The ocean answered for him in the only way the ocean knows how to answer. The USS Cyclops, named for a mythological monster who was ultimately destroyed by his own limitations, sailed into history and out of it in March of 1918, and left behind nothing but questions. The questions are still there. The ship is still missing. And somewhere in the Atlantic, in the dark and the cold and the pressure and the silence that has been accumulating for 107 years, the most complete unsolved mystery in the history of the United States Navy rests on the ocean floor and keeps its secrets. We have not found her. We may never find her. The sea does not give back what it takes.